Ever wonder how a human being can turn in or tell on or cause havoc in another human being's life? That's what we're discussing today on The Meninist, coming up in just a minute. So, Dad, it's been an interesting week again this week.
What's going on in the news?
Oh, boy. We've had a lot of things. First of all, I heard the Arizona audits are supposed to be coming out Friday, the results from them.
It's time to hunker down.
Yep, I think it's...
That's going to be interesting.
That's going to be very interesting. And I heard that's supposed to come out Friday. And we've got a lot of border issues this week with Haitians coming up from South America through Mexico to the U.S. border. And there's been a lot of interesting just news about them because from what I've read, the Biden administration promised the American people to make sure the Haitians do not come in here illegally. Mm-hmm. But then I read this morning a whole bunch have come in illegally anyways. So to be honest, I'm not sure. That's just small things I'm reading.
Yeah. What about COVID news?
So COVID news, the mandates after Biden's speech, like in the media, became an uproar from the conservative population. And then it kind of has been a null, but I know a lot of people are fighting. Project Veritas came out with a video about a nurse who exposed, basically, she works for a federal doctor's office that's federally funded, and she recorded some doctors admitting that they do not report any terrible side effects with regards to the COVID vaccine. And she kind of outed it, and so that's been in the news the last 24 hours.
Right. I know that they're having issues with remdesivir.
Remdesivir?
Yeah, apparently that's not... the drug of choice. Apparently it's killing people.
Uh-oh.
So ivermectin is still having really good results.
Yes. The monoclonal antibodies, too, are having really positive results.
Yep. So the therapeutics are working.
Yes.
Vaccines are still questionable.
That's right.
You know, some people are getting them. Some people don't want to get them. I personally don't want to get it.
No.
I'm not getting the jab.
No, absolutely not.
I rather, I've got the antibodies and so do you.
That's right.
But anyway, this is,
That's this week, though. But today our podcast is going to be a little somber because this
was a tough one.
Yes, because it is a tough subject, especially how it came about. But I think it's going to be extremely informative. I'm excited about this one.
But one thing that I think you have brought forth in your podcast, The Meninist, is that you're talking about topics that really nobody else is talking about.
That's right.
And this
or very few.
Very few. Yeah,
yes.
And this one's a rough one.
This is a rough one. But I think out of all the podcasts we've done, in my humble opinion, this one is the most important one.
I agree.
And that's what excites me. The topic doesn't excite me.
Right.
The ability to come on here and talk about this particular subject is what excites me, because I really do think every single person needs to know about this particular topic.
Yes.
And so with that, what are we talking about today, Pop?
Well, the Milgram
Milgram Experiment. The Milgram Experiment.
And let me just say that the correlation between what's going on today with our authorities
That's right.
over us and what this thing revealed back in the 60s is stunning to me.
It is. And I'm going to talk a little bit how I came about it, because I am obviously not a psychological expert. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. But as part of my graduate work in education, being a teacher, you have to take a child psychology class. You have to take several psychology classes, but I learned this one in my child psychology class because teachers are considered to be an authority to a child. And so with that authority comes a large amount of responsibility. And the psychology class was teaching us how children react to authority in their lives, as a child to a parent, child to a teacher, and then child to other authorities in their lives. And the professor had us study the Milgram Experiment to show how strong of an influence an authority figure or a quote-unquote expert can have the influence on a person. And so that's how I came to know about it. It absolutely fascinated me when I learned about this experiment, and I started deep diving into this experiment. And I also have a passion for teaching the Holocaust in my classroom. When I was a teacher in the public school classroom for 15 years, every year in the month of January, because that's Holocaust Remembrance Month, I would teach about the Holocaust. And most of the kids coming to me, because you're talking about high school, already knew about the Holocaust. They had studied it in their social studies classes previously. So I like to tell stories about the Holocaust. And part of telling these stories is asking some guiding questions with regards to the stories, because the stories were either about the Jewish people who survived the Holocaust and telling their story, or they were about the Germans or the Polish that hid Jews. The stories were either one, from either one of the perspective, depending on what grade level I was teaching, because you have to be sensitive with the kids when you're teaching a topic like this, because it is hard to fathom.
I'm sure it's very sensitive.
That's right.
It's a sensitive topic.
That's right. And I taught Jewish students, so I had to be very sensitive in this topic. But I think, and I would always tell my students, it is something everybody should remember and nobody should ever forget. And so I made a pact to teach it. And in the topic of either a Jewish person surviving the Holocaust or a non-Jewish person saving another Jewish person in the Holocaust, the question I would always ask is, how did non-Jewish citizens come to the point where they were turning in their Jewish citizen friends and sometimes family? Like, how did that happen?
And these were ordinary people.
How did we go from a free society, essentially in Europe, of people living amongst each other fine, to now non-Jewish people willing to turn in Jewish people, knowing the outcome? They knew the outcome. The outcome was very obvious, and they knew what was going to happen to these citizens that they were living with and living next to. How did psychologically they turn from living freely together to that? Because it's such an extreme, and that's where the Milgram Experiment comes in.
Okay.
And so Milgram was a man who was interested in learning after World War II ended how how did Nazi soldiers go from being ordinary people before World War II started to being influenced by Hitler's regime to then turning in and killing ordinary citizens just because of their religion and what they believed. And so he decided to do an experiment to see how does authority work? How does psychological authority work on a non-authoritative human being? That was the experiment. So the Milgram Experiment started in July 1961, and he looked at the court case, which was the Nuremberg War Trials after World War II. And the Nuremberg War Trials basically were putting Nazi soldiers on the stand, and some citizens who turned in Jews were also on trial. And the justification that was given in court for the Nazi soldiers were they just following orders from their superiors, and that's why they did what they did, or were they actually accomplices to the annihilation of the Jewish people?
Mm-hmm.
Those were the two questions that were brought up in trial. So those were the two questions Milgram was looking at in his experiment. The experiment took place at Yale University, which you and I know is a prestigious university. That's important because later in the results, the location is part of the experiment. Okay? I'll get more into that later. There were 3 roles in the experiment. There was the learner, there was the teacher, and then there was the quote-unquote professor. Okay? If you could bring up that picture, the graphic of the actual experiment so that everybody can see what I'm talking about.
Sure.
Okay, so in this graphic you can see you have a fake test subject. The reason why it's fake is because the test subject on the left is an actor, and he's in on the experiment. So you see electrical probes hooked up to him, but they were not actual electrical probes. There was no electricity pumped into him. He's an actor, and his job is to tell an answer, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And when he gets the answers wrong and the experimenter on the right shocks him, his job is to act like he's in pain, to scream and act like he's in pain.
And just to reiterate, they're not in the same room, right?
They're not. You can see there's a wall between them.
Right.
The blue room on the bluish.
So they can't see each other.
No, that's right. The bluish room on the right is separate from the pinkish room on the left.
Gotcha.
Okay. And then you see the experimenter. The experimenter is the one that the experiment is being conducted on. He is not paid. He has no idea what's about to happen. He has no clue what the experiment's about when he comes and when he offers to be a part of the experiment. Okay, and you see that he is hooked up. He is not hooked up, but he's sitting in a chair in front of a machine that has buttons. And the buttons are of different volts. The volts go from 15 volts to 375 volts. And then there's an extra set of button that goes up to 450 volts.
Which is lethal.
Which is lethal.
Right.
As the voltage increases, the pain increases on the fake test subject.
Right.
And the experimenter knows that going in. He knows what the voltage buttons are, and he knows the outcome of what could happen.
As he's increasing the shock level, the fake test subject is going to yell and scream.
That's right. Depending on the voltage.
So he can hear the screams, but he can't see the subject.
He can hear the screams,
right.
But he cannot see the subject. That is correct.
Okay.
Okay. Then you have, or the fake test subject, because then you have the administrator.
Mm-hmm.
The word says subject here, but that's the administrator. This guy knows about the experiment. To be clear, it was not Milgram himself. It was another person, another actor. He knows what's happening. He knows that the fake test subject is not being shocked. And he also knows that the experimenter knows nothing.
So he's in on it.
He's in on it.
Okay.
That's right. And his job is to tell the experimenter what to do. All right. He's telling the experimenter what buttons to push and why to push them and when to push them. All right. So he is dressed in a gray lab coat. He's got on glasses. He's got pens in his pocket. He's got a clipboard. He looks very official.
So he looks medical professorish.
Medical professorish. That's exactly right.
Okay.
He was dressed to look like an expert on purpose.
Gotcha.
Okay. Because that's part of the experiment. Okay. And he in the experiment, he introduces himself as a professor. He introduces himself as the authority figure. He is the one that tells the experimenter what to do.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Okay. The act is left up to the experimenter. The experimenter does not have to push the buttons, but the experimenter is told what to do by the subject wearing the gray lab coat. Okay? Okay, and this is basically the gist of the experiment. The fake test subject is told a series of words that he has to remember in a certain order. And the series of words was based on a particular subject, like animals, like dog, cat, mouse. Okay? But he's hooked up to electrodes, all right? Supposedly, they were fake electrodes.
Mm-hmm.
The experimenter was supposed to ask the fake test subject to give him a grouping of words based on a subject. But the subject didn't match what the experimenter was told on purpose, because the experimenter was the whole experiment was to see how far the experimenter would push the buttons in the voltage. So the answer had to be wrong, so he'd push the button, right? And again, Everybody's in on the experiment except the experimenter. Okay.
So you're actually testing this individual to find out how far he would go in administering
right.
an electrical shock
That's
to
right.
another human being.
That's right.
He can hear the moans and the groans and the ouches. He can't see them, but so it's sight unseen, but he can hear them.
He can hear them. And the hearing part is what's important because
This
that's
is
driving
fascinating.
that's driving the psychology.
Yeah.
Okay, so if I'm the guy pushing the buttons and you're the guy with the electrodes, the first thing I do, the professor tells me the grouping of animals, and I'll say dog, cat, mouse. And you'll say pets. But pets isn't the correct answer. The correct answer was supposed to be animals, but you're in on it. So you said pets on purpose.
Okay.
Right? You're hooked up to the electrodes. So now I got to hit a button because you said the wrong answer. So the professor is telling me hit 15 volts. So I go, okay, and I hit the 15 volt button. And you, the paid actor, go, ooh, I felt that, right? But it's only 15 volts. So it wasn't deadly. It's just a little bit of zick because you got the wrong answer, right? So now I say another group of words. So I say red, yellow, orange, and you're in on it. So you say rainbow, but that wasn't the correct answer. The correct answer was colors, right? So now the professor tells me go to 100 volts. So I hit 100 volts, and now you go, ooh, right? And I can hear your ooh, okay, because I can hear you, but I can't see you. All right. Remember, you're in on it. You're not being electrocuted. Okay. So now the professor in the gray coat tells me another group of pairs, and it might be apple, orange, peach. And you say fruit, but that's the wrong answer. The answer was fruit salad. So now the professor says, go to 200 volts.
My gosh. And it just keeps on incrementing.
It keeps increasing.
Oh, God.
Okay. To see how far the experimenter would go. But
Right.
as the experimenter starts getting nervous because the fake test subject is screaming, the experimenter becomes more aggressive. And that's part of the experiment. Okay. So now the professor starts screaming, I said push 300 volts. Well, now the experimenter starts getting nervous because he has been told what happens if the voltage increases, and his ethics and morals start coming to play. Do I hit the button because the professor's telling me to, or do I want to not cause harm on this person I can't see who is screaming? And as the experiment continued, the fake test person that was screaming would start begging and pleading for this to stop. Okay. As the voltage started increasing, the fake test subject would say, no, please stop. Get me out of here. I don't want to do this anymore. Because the experimenter doesn't know he's paid. That's what he's supposed to be saying, to put pressure on the experimenter. And the professor...
So he's calling out for mercy, essentially.
Right. As he's calling out for mercy, the professor is stating several different things. And if you'll give me a second, I want to pull this up so I read it accurately, so I'm not misquoting the study. Okay. He's stating several different things. Hold on. Give me just a second. I want to make sure I pull up the right one. In the meantime, you can see the picture, and you can see that the fake test subject, right, is in a separate room. Again, it's important to note that, but that the experimenter can hear everything. Okay, that's very important that he can hear everything.
He can hear. So the senses, the sight is removed, but he can hear.
So the first prod that the subject, the professor, the guy in the gray lab coat would say was, please continue. So if the experimenter started saying, wait, I don't know if I should push the button, the professor would first command was, please continue. If the experimenter rose up and said anything else negatively about pushing the buttons, the second prod would be, the experiment requires you to continue. Now let's look at the word requires.
Boy, that word's been really used quite a bit in these days.
Yes, it has. Now, the experimenter was paid $4.50 to do this experiment. It was volunteer. He did not have to come. It was advertised in a newspaper because this is the 1960s. They didn't have the internet. The experimenter drove to Yale University to be a volunteer.
Mm-hmm.
Is the experimenter truly required?
No, he's not required.
No, he's not required.
He's not required. No.
No. This is the United States of America. You could get up and walk out. This is a volunteer study.
Correct.
But the professor's presence, his expertise, his lab coat, he would say the experiment requires you to continue. Now there's pressure. If I don't continue, I don't get to fulfill the experiment. And that's why I'm here. Okay, so you have to look at the language.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's look at the prod 3. If the experimenter continues to protest the experiment because now the voltage has increased and you've got the fake actor screaming, please stop, I don't want to do this anymore, let me out, which is what he was screaming and told to scream. The next prod is, it is absolutely essential that you continue. Well, have you heard absolutely essential or the word essential lately?
It is the buzzwords of 2021.
You have
it's absolutely essential.
You also have essential workers. The word essential is used a lot in modern day lately. And then if it got to the fatal 450 volts.
Here we go.
And the experimenter is saying, absolutely not, I'm not going to do this. It's going to kill him. The last prod was, you have no other choice but to continue. So he's heard all 4 prods. Please continue. The experiment requires you to continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. And then the last prod, you have no other choice. Well, what has been recently mandated?
You have no other choice.
If you don't do this, there's consequences. You don't have a choice.
Yeah, because we're there now.
We're there now. And so if you could pull up the pie chart, I'm going to go over some things after we share the results. But here is the results of the Milgram experiment. And you can see this is in a graphic. Everybody is easy to see. But you can see that 65% of all the participants, and I'm going to go over numbers here in a minute, agreed to push the fatal button.
Wow.
The psychology proved that with force and expertise, as well as setting, Yale University, the experimenters would get to the point of pushing the fatal button. Now, what was interesting as the voltage increased, the actor on the other side, who was hooked up to probes, quote unquote, would get more and more aggressive about stopping and it being more painful. And when the experimenter hit the last button, it would go silent. It would go silent. So to show the fatal blow, right? But 65% of the people, the experimenters who this was performed on, were willing to give the fatal blow to the fake test subject once that 4th probe was given. You don't have a choice.
65%.
Yes. Now, what I was intrigued about, because I'm a rebel at heart and I know how I would have reacted in this particular situation, I'd have been you see that 2.5 as they said, hell no, and they got up and walked out.
Yeah.
Okay. That's me. That's my nature. I am don't tell me what to do. You ain't going to tell me what to do. But I wasn't that way until I learned about this experiment.
Oh, really?
This experiment changed my psychology forever. And I started questioning everything. Because who gets to define who's an expert? That male in that gray coat was not an expert. He was an actor.
Mm-hmm.
But he was looked to be an expert and sounded to be an expert and told to be the expert. So therefore he automatically was. So now, who's an expert? And who gets to define who an expert is?
That's a good point.
So now I question everybody and everything. I'm sorry. I question pastors. I question politicians. I question medical experts. I question media experts. I question anybody who says an expert. I'm looking at you with a side eye and I'm doing my own research. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah.
Period. End of story.
Yep.
And you've known me. Do I not do that?
You do.
Everybody, everything, all the time. And it's because I learned about the Milgram experiment.
I think you as a child, your number one question was why? Why? You know,
Shock.
You asked Amy to do something, she would say why. You would have to actually explain it to her.
Yes. Yes, I've always been inquisitive in that way, but I was also compliant.
Right.
And I would eventually do it.
Right.
But I became non-compliant real quick after my child's psychology class.
Yeah.
I was like, no, I'm not. Unless you tell me why, and I've done my own research and I value the answer.
Right.
So anyway, I want to read some stuff before we go on, and feel free to stop me.
No, you go right ahead.
So we showed the pie graph, and here was the conclusion. Ordinary people are likely to follow orders. This is straight from the psychology website where the experiment was posted. Okay. Ordinary people are like, and of course it was posted way later because it was done in the 1960s before the internet.
Mm-hmm.
Ordinary people are likely to follow orders given by an authority figure, even to the extent of killing an innocent human being. Obedience to authority is ingrained in us all from the way we were brought up. People tend to obey orders from other people if they recognize their authority as morally right and or legally based. This response to legitimate authority is learned in a variety of situations, for example, in the family, school, and workplace. Okay? And then Milgram went on and published in 1974 his personal findings from the experiment. But it's important to note a couple of things. When you reference an experiment, you have to look at all the factors, because you can look at the 65% and say, oh my gosh, but there's reasons behind that 65%. You can also look at the little slivers on the right side of that pie graph, and you can see, all right, now let's look at that side and see how come those people reacted the way they did. Okay, and it's important to look at that side. Even though the 65% is so shocking, it's important to look at the right side of that pie graph too, because there's some psychology in those guys too.
No doubt.
All right,
yeah.
and that's what I'm about to talk about. All right, so you have two states according to this experiment. You have the autonomous state. Those people direct their own actions and they take responsibility for the results of those actions. So that's my favorite state. Where you say...
Is that the 2.5?
Yes.
Because there's 3 2.5s.
Okay, will you read those 3 for me?
I can't see them.
All right, there's the extreme intensity shock, 2.5.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah, that's 300 volts.
And then you have the dangerous severe shock.
Yeah.
And then you have the 450 volt shock. But those are the people who refuse to do it, 2.5%.
So 2.5 refused to give the 450 volts.
Yes. That is correct. And then 2.5.
Oh, I see the color coding. Okay.
You see them?
So that one pinkish light pink is 300 volts.
That's right.
12.5% actually went ahead and hit that button.
That's right.
I gotcha. Okay.
No, the 12.5 refused.
Refused.
Yeah.
They refused.
Yes.
All right. So 12.5 refused.
Yes.
Then
they stopped. At that point is when they stopped.
That they quit.
Yes.
10% of the people quit at 315.
Okay.
Volts.
Okay.
5% at 330.
Uh-huh.
Wow.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So it's crazy how those are the people who didn't. And you got to look at those side too. What made 12.5% people stop at an earlier...
At 300 volts.
At less
300
voltage.
volts is still a jolt.
That's still a jolt.
Yeah.
But a large portion in comparison to the rest said, no, I'm stopping here.
Yeah.
And those are the people I'm interested in. Because their morals and values superseded the person in the lab coat at that point. That would be me.
Right.
I misspoke when I said 2.5. I meant the 12.5. That would have been me. I would have had a hard time inflicting pain on somebody, even if I was paid and even if I knew what was happening. I would have a hard time doing that.
Still, you've got 2.5 of the people at 375 volts. Which
That's
is
right.
A danger zone.
That's right.
And only 2.5 people said no.
No, at that point.
Son of a gun.
I know. Okay, so you have two states of psychology, the autonomous state. These are the people that take responsibility. I did it. I shouldn't have done it. I'm going to do better next time. Okay, so they don't listen to experts.
Mm-hmm.
They own their own self. Okay, then you have the agentic state. People allow others to direct their actions and then pass off the responsibility for the consequences to the person giving the orders. Have you heard you have to get vaccinated to protect those who are vaccinated?
Oh, yeah.
That's this. That's the agentic state. So now I'm not going to take responsibility for the fact that I took a vaccine and still got sick. So something's wrong with the vaccine. I'm not going to say that. I'm going to blame the unvaccinated for the reason why I got sick. That's the agentic state, where you direct what happened to you on somebody else.
So it's interesting now to look at the pie chart again.
Uh-huh.
And what was that percentage of that state?
These are just the two separate states. There wasn't a percentage aligned to it.
Gotcha.
Yeah. There's just the two.
Okay.
So you have the autonomous state where you take responsibility for yourself. And then you have the agentic state where if something happens to you, you point responsibility on somebody else.
Gotcha.
So those, I find it interesting in the media and in the news and what you see people is those who have gotten the vaccine and still got COVID are now blaming the unvaccinated.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember with the masks? Do you remember if you didn't wear a mask, you'd kill grandma?
Oh, yeah.
If you didn't wear a mask, you were the one killing grandma.
I'm wearing this boogered up,
not
full
the fact
of germs
that
mask in order to protect you.
Right. Not the fact that masks didn't work.
No.
It wasn't that I'm taking responsibility for the fact that I've made a dumb decision and masks aren't working. It's that I'm going to blame others for the fact that you're not wearing a mask. It's your fault.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the autonomous state. That's the agentic state. The autonomous is when you take responsibility. Okay, you do your own research. You take responsibility. You make your choice. And if something happens, it's because it's your choice. You did it. Where the agentic state, you make a choice, and if it goes wrong, it's somebody else's fault.
Which sure sounds like a certain party.
Yes, it sure does.
We're not mentioning any names, but you all know who they are.
That is true. All right, so now we need to go into the variations because when you look at an experiment, he did 18 different experiments, Milgram did. And so you have to go into the variations to understand the experiment fully.
Okay.
He wanted to test different things to see if the results would change. So he changed the uniform. The uniform was a gray lab coat. That was a symbol of the authority. In this particular case, the experimenter wore a different lab coat. He didn't wear a lab coat. He wore everyday clothes. So the experimenter, the professor, didn't wear a lab coat. He wore everyday clothes. The outcome was the obedience level dropped 20%.
Okay, so
the lab coat mattered.
The lab coat gave a status.
That's right.
Of authority.
That's right. When the status of authority via clothes was taken away, the obedience level dropped 20%.
That's really interesting.
Right. So what do doctors wear?
White lab coats.
That's right. Why?
Wait, you got to hang the stethoscope around your neck.
Right.
That makes it even more.
Right. And I'm not talking crap about doctors. Y'all earned your white coat.
Oh yeah, man, no doubt.
I'm not talking. But there's a reason they wear a white coat.
Wait a minute. I got a problem with doctors that are in bed with pharmaceuticals
yes.
and are preventing patients from receiving the proper care that's
absolutely
needed, especially during this pandemic. I've got a problem with that.
When you go to a doctor, do you care if they have a white coat on?
No.
Okay, me neither. Okay,
we go to a doctor who doesn't have a white coat.
Yeah, that's right. He doesn't wear a white coat.
He wears freaking camos.
Yeah. Okay, the next thing they changed was the location. So the experiment was originally at Yale University. That's a prestigious college, top-notch college, right?
Right.
So if you go into an experiment at Yale, that's very authoritative, right?
Mm-hmm.
Very professional. So they changed the location. When they changed to offices, rundown, they actually went to a rundown office and did the experiment. The obedience dropped 47.5%.
Wow. That is amazing.
47.
That's almost half.
Yes. So if you stand behind a presidential podium, but then you stand behind a wooden podium, it would be interesting to me if the obedience would be the same. If you're a president, you stand behind a presidential podium and you address your nation.
With a presidential logo.
But then if you stand behind a wooden podium, you'd be taken as serious.
Good
no,
point.
Location matters, is what the study showed. Okay, especially when it comes to obedience level.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so then they brought in, 2 teacher conditions. So let me read it. When participants could instruct an assistant to press the switches, okay, so basically they brought in 2 people instead of 1 person, all right? Mm-hmm. So when participants could instruct an assistant to press the switches, 92.5% shocked to the maximum 450 volts. When there is less personal responsibility, obedience increases. So when there was 2 people pushing the buttons at the same time, they brought in 2 participants at the same time, where one could take on the responsibility over another, more people were willing to push the button because now 2 people were responsibility. The responsibility didn't lie on you, just you, right? So now you have an influencer. Now you can share the responsibility. More fatal shocks were pushed. Okay, touch proximity. The teacher had to force the learner's hand down onto the shock plate when they refused to participate after 150 volts. So the professor guy in the lab coat would physically push their hand. That was one of the impacts. If you didn't do it, I was going to come take your hand and I was going to make you do it. Obedience fell 30%. So people didn't like that. They didn't like to be pushed. Okay, if you touch me, I'm not doing it. Okay? All right, social support conditions. 2 other participants were also teachers, but refused to obey. Confederate 1 stopped at 150 volts, and Confederate 2 stopped at 210 volts. They took 2 professors, 2 guys in a lab coat. One of them pretended to refuse to bark the commands to the guy pushing the buttons. So one of them got quote unquote convicted and said, no, I don't want to do this anymore. This isn't right. And he's got a lab coat and he's got the pens and he's got the clipboard. Then now the authority decreased and the level of obedience was 10%. So when you had one authority questioning another authority, the person pushing the buttons was much less obedient, dropped to 10%.
That's where conviction comes into play.
Well, not only conviction, but the influence of another expert that opposes the other one.
Right. So, yeah, they're opposing each other, and that in turn caused the obedience to dissipate.
Yes. So then they took the professor, the guy in the lab coat, and they put him outside the room. And he had to bark commands to the person pushing the buttons from outside the room. He wasn't inside with him.
Okay.
And obedience fell to 20.5%. So the authority figure has to be up close, in your face, in proximity. In the news, all the time. In the media, giving shorts, all the time. The expert's got to be there. Whose face do we see? In the mainstream media, over and over, telling us what to do. You're going to have another booster shot. Who is that? Who is that one doctor? He just won't leave. You just see him over and over and over and over again. Why? His face, he can't just quit. He has to now continue to be the expert. Dr. Funky. That's right. Because if he goes away and you get another person in there, are people going to be as obedient? No way. He's the expert now, the face. He's the face of the pandemic. Yes. Yeah. So he can't just go away. All right. So those were the alternate experiments to see what would happen, which I found just as fascinating. That's fascinating. Yes. Yeah. And so when you look at today, when you look at what happens today, after you learn about the experiment and all the psychological factors, you can't help but question. I can anyways. I'll speak for myself. I can't help but question everybody and everything all the time. Yeah. And that's why this experiment is so impacting. That's why I was excited to do this today. It was an excellent teaching. But we're going to go ahead and, I don't know, maybe we should save this for another podcast. Well, how much more time do I have? You probably got about 5-6 minutes. Okay. I do want to go over some ethical issues. When you have a psychological study, I'll put it in the camera so you can see. You do want to talk about ethical issues in a study. For example, all the experimenters were male. And that's important to note because to really know about humans, you have to be able to do both genders. So would the results have been the same if you would have had women? Well, there's a more modern test that was done that I watched the other day. It was done in England. They did have a female, and she basically didn't take it to the full extreme. Oh, okay. She went probably a third of the way, and then she backed away. Okay, interesting. Because, women are more compassionate. They're not That's right. Be so, although I don't know if we want to go there, but there's a certain Nazi party that these women were in charge of basically the death camps, and they were in the middle of a war, and the Nazis gave them, and actually they put this out in the newspaper. They were hiring women to
coordinate a lot of the death camps, and
Okay.
essentially they gave them room and board, uniforms, and a pretty good lifestyle. And here's the most fascinating thing. They were 10 deep in applications.
Well, I know you sent me that, and I do want to talk about that, but I want to talk about that next podcast.
Yeah, we can
because
hold back
I really want to get into the psychology behind World War II and what happened.
Okay.
Because now that you know the experiment, you can understand why they did what they did.
It's interesting.
Because you're going, oh my God, how did these people? It also, what I prefer to look at though, is the people who went against the regime and actually hid and saved Jews. Those people.
Yes.
Those are the people I'm more interested in, because those people had some cojones.
Yeah.
Because you, not only were you killed, your whole freaking family were killed, and so was all your neighbors.
Right. And you were hiding Jews.
If you hit a Jew, you were killed, your whole family was killed, and so were all of your neighbors.
Yeah.
Because it was so you
brutal.
had to have, pardon me, balls. You had to have straight balls to do that. And those are the people I'm interested in.
Great point.
And that's the right side of that pie chart. And so that's who I want to talk about next podcast.
Okay.
Those who are willing to stand up against the authority. That's who interests me. Okay.
So you're interested in these folks?
Yes.
The 12.5
yes.
and the 10%ers?
Yes. That's who I'm interested in. That's who I'm interested in.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we need more people like that, don't we?
A couple more ethical issues that I want to talk about with regards to Milgram, just so that we're fair and we're not showing a bias. He did go back and interview every single participant. It's important to know that they were all told that it was actually a setup, that the other guy was an actor, that nobody was harmed after the experiment. It's called a decompression, and he went through each participant, decompressed, and explained the study. And then he followed up with them after a year to make sure they were okay. Because it's got to be pretty traumatic. You know what I mean? To go through something like that. And it was a blind, so you didn't know what you were getting into until you got into it, right? So he then followed up with all of them after a year to see how they were doing. Everybody was fine. And he polled them after a year. And 83.7% said they were so happy to be a part of the experiment and they would do it again. And 1.3 said they wish they were never involved. So most of them were glad to be involved. They probably learned a whole lot. I bet they did. And who they were on the inside. You know what I mean? Okay. It's important to know signs of tension included. Many of the participants were visibly distressed during the experiment. Signs of tension included trembling, sweating, stuttering, laughing nervously, biting lips, and digging fingernails into palms of hands. 3 participants had uncontrollable seizures, and many pleaded to be allowed to stop the experiment. Milgram described a businessman reducing to a twitching, stuttering wreck. So, this wreaked all kinds of havoc on these poor participants.
I can imagine.
Yes.
Can you imagine getting down to the point where I couldn't do it? I couldn't do it.
Once the participants were debriefed after the experiment, Milgram made sure he showed them the Confederate who was, by the way, the person who was attached to the electrodes, the actor, was called a Confederate in his study. He showed them that they were okay, showed them that they were fine. They admitted that they were part of the study. All right. He did, like I said, he did follow up after a year. They had the right to withdraw when you participate in a psychological study. The BPS states that researchers should make it plain to participants that they are free to withdraw at any time. Did Milgram give participants an opportunity to withdraw? That's the question. The experimenter gave 4 verbal prods, which we talked about earlier. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue, and you have no other choice. Milgram argued that can't be a deception because that was the whole point of the experiment. If he gave them an ability to withdraw, then he wouldn't be able to get to the 4th prod. He had to get to the 4th prod to conduct the experiment. Milgram pointed out that although the right to withdraw was made partially difficult, it was possible as 35% of the participants chose to withdraw. And that's the right side of the pie graph, the top ones. All right. So even though the 4 prods made it seem like they couldn't, they could because 35% did. So it wasn't that they were held against their will. They were just verbally told, which is part of the experiment. So you can't take that portion away, right? But it's important to note. If you go on this psychology website, you can there's clips of audio that you can hear. You can see little blue clips, and you can go and you can hear actual recordings of the experiment happening. There's also video of the experiment that you can see portions of the experiment happening on YouTube. If you are interested in this, I highly suggest that you go listen to the clips and watch the video because it is very interesting to see how the experimenters, like I said, when I was teaching this in my classes, I would play all the clips because the first portion of the clips are the people saying, I don't want to do this anymore. The experimenters saying, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm done. $4.50, it's not worth it. I'm done. And you'd hear the click of them getting up and walking out.
Yeah.
Right. But then towards the end of the clips, you hear them stressfully pushing. You hear the professor screaming in their ear, you have no choice. And you hear them pushing the fatal button.
Oh, my gosh.
And so it's interesting to definitely go through and take a look at this. I found the experiment, and the exact one I would use is on simple psychology. You can see it there. If you type in simple psychology, Milgram Experiment, Milgram, you can research it for yourself. It is very fascinating. And before we go, if you don't mind, Pop, if you are interested in novels to read to your kids about the Holocaust, about survivors, which, again, I told you I like to focus on the survivors and the people who helped the Jews rather than the doomsday of... I didn't like to focus on Hitler and the Nazis. I like to focus on the survivors and the people who fought against them.
Right.
All right. So 3 I would recommend. This is Night. It is a true story told by the actual survivor, Elie Wiesel is how you say his last name. And he did survive the Holocaust. It is a brutal story. I would recommend it for freshmen, 9th grade and above, because it is very detailed. He leaves nothing to the imagination. But he survives, and his story of survival is amazing. And he was in Auschwitz, so he was like in the epicenter of the Holocaust. The next one is another true story about a little girl who her family realized that she looked very different from the rest of the family. She happened to have light hair and light eyes, whereas everybody else had dark hair and dark eyes. And we realized that the Germans had a fascination with people with light hair and light eyes. So they actually pretended for her to be German, and they sent her to go get food for their family. And that's how they survived. And she tells her story in this book called The Girl Who Survived. I read this to my boys and they loved it. It is a fascinating story. And then the last one is When Hitler Stole the Pink Rabbit. And this is not a true story, but it's called historical fiction. So it's based on events, and it is about Anna. And she basically survives, but it teaches the story of how she survives, and they had to move, kind of like in what's the movie? The hills are alive in the sound of music.
Sound of Music. Yeah.
Yes, you know how they had to move at the end of that movie to escape. This is a similar story of how they escaped the Nazis. And this is elementary school, about 5th grade. This could be read at any age, and this one is definitely high school. So those are some 3 levels.
And you can pick. I'm sure you can pick those up on Amazon.
Amazon, any bookstore. They have. I've seen copies at Walmart. They are fantastic books if your kids are interested in that subject.
Wow.
Yes.
An interesting subject, no doubt.
We'll dive into more of it next week.
Okay.
I think we need to talk about the women who were employed by Hitler to kill Jews, women that goes against kind of our nature. So it's a very interesting psychological study of these women. And we also need to talk about the kids because he got them involved. They were called the brown shirts, Hitler Youth.
Children, yeah. Actually, they were Ace's age.
That's right.
Much. They were in their teens.
But they were still impressionable, very impressionable.
Very impressionable. And they became desensitized
That's
to a lot
right.
of things that were going on.
And
which
it's the desensitization I want to talk about because guess what was just approved by the FDA?
What's that?
The vaccine for kids as young as 5.
That is nuts.
So I see a lot of parallels. You could call me crazy.
I do too.
We get called all kinds of things
Conspiracy
because
theories.
we parallel
hatters. I mean,
yes, and I'm going to parallel it If you don't like it, you don't have to watch the podcast.
Right.
I'm sorry. I see a
There
lot
are
of
some
parallels.
amazing parallels that are going on, and it's secular when it comes to history.
And I want to make
Things
it
come back around, and we got to be wise as foxes.
That's right. And I don't want to demoralize the Holocaust. I'm not comparing the killing of 6 million Jewish people to the vaccine. That's not what I'm saying.
Right.
I am not saying that at all. Don't get it twisted. I am comparing the psychology behind both. That's what the psychology behind the ability for somebody to turn in their citizen and the psychology behind somebody to turn in their citizen, because you are seeing in the news that if you have people if you know family members who participated in January 6th, if you have family members who you need to contact trace, you can call this number. I mean, it is basically the same psychology.
Well, it's happening in China as we speak.
That's right. If you don't wear a mask, you're going to kill grandma. And if
people are in prison for,
yes.
And you have family members that are turning them in.
If you don't get the vaccine, you are now killing those who are vaccinated. Like, this psychology behind this is very similar to me, and I will compare it.
Well, the Holy Spirit, in closing, the Holy Spirit is the ultimate psychologist.
That's right.
And what he says in Matthew 24:12, he says, because of the increase of wickedness, which is extremely important, when wickedness increases, the love of most will grow cold.
That's right.
So he's saying essentially that because we are, we've allowed this wickedness to come in, and it comes in,
yes,
and it's here.
Without a doubt.
We grow cold.
That's right.
In our compassion towards others.
That's right.
So we pray right now that we pray for each other.
That's right.
We pray for our country.
Yep.
We pray for our leaders. We pray for our enemies.
That's right. Absolutely.
And we ask the Lord to move upon their hearts.
That's right. And I think that's a wonderful place to close until next week.
We love you all.
We love you. We hope you have a wonderful week. Check it out, the Milgram Experiment.
See ya.
See ya. Bye.